Hi everyone. This is a new stream where we get to have like an AMA Ask Me Anything questions. I am joined today by a group of software engineers. All of you guys are from South Africa, I think, right? Everyone? Okay,
Correct. Yeah.
fantastic. Ryan is a near and dear friend of mine, and he's been some of the people that are early adapters of the standard, at least in South Africa. And he's been kind of trying to implement it and kind of cultivate it. Him and Trent, and Ivani, and I'm just hoping like each and every one of you kind of introduce yourself to the world so people would reach out to you if they have any questions and want to learn from experience. Ryan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Julian. Yeah, I work in the data and analytics sector within BSG, and we're really trying to apply the standard within that big data analytics space. And yeah, I have a few questions on structure and just how do we make this work? Because we want it to work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Trent, do you want to talk a little bit about you, your experience and your background?
Yeah, sure. I'm Trent. I work at the same company as Ryan and Ivani. Ryan's been a mentor to me actually in the kind of software space. So, yeah, my background was largely in like more the kind of like math space. I want to say, and like software was very kind of like new to me. Trying to
Yeah.
figure things out, like and really bring structure to the way I wrote code. Because it
Mhm.
was mostly my experience writing stuff to I don't know solve a very specific problem, and then your scripts become like thousands of lines long, and you've hacked out a problem, and I needed to take that next step. It was like, how do I split things up and make like a bigger application?
Yep.
Yeah, Ryan's been really helpful to or nice enough to spend time with me and kind of teach me these things. And I think it was like last year sometime, yeah, he introduced me to the standard,
Standard.
and I
Yeah.
watched a whole bunch of your videos, read the some of the stuff on GitHub. Really enjoying it. Yeah, trying to bring it into the data and analytics realm as well. But
Yeah,
yeah,
this is
um, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead as well.
Pleasure to meet you, Trent. There's also
Yeah.
a member of the standard community, Filippi. He's all about data, and he's been
Mhm.
trying to bring the standard to R programming
Yeah.
language, which is very interesting. We'll dig a little bit deeper into that. Ivani, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you guys hear me? I've been having network issues.
Loud and clear.
All good.
Good.
Got you.
Cool. Perfect. So I'm Ivani. I'm a software developer at BSG as well. Same company with Ryan and Trent. More on the Java backend development side. I do anything and everything really, but primarily some Java backend development.
Hmm.
Really interested in things like DevOps and cloud and things like that. Ryan and I have very odd conversations about software at 11 p.m. at night until 2 a.m. in the morning. So that's how I ended up here. So
Cool. Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm happy to meet with all of you. And just so you know, we are streaming on all social media platforms, so X, Twitch, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, everywhere, people will sometimes engage with us, just really lighthearted, nice comments like, hey, how are you? All the way up to, things like, this doesn't make any sense. Explain it to us, so just, you know, let's just chat and see how it goes. With these live streams, you never know, right? It just it goes wherever it goes, right? And hopefully this would be a useful session. Just I want to let you know something, because this is a weekend for me. There is no time restriction, so take as much time you need. I'm willing to sit down here and talk to you guys as long as you need. But also more importantly, I don't care about structure either. I believe like you're gonna bring up the most pressing issues, but even if you didn't and there's something more pressing, we're here. We're not going anywhere. Let's get it all sorted out together. What do you think about that? You think that's a good deal?
So
Okay.
excited.
Right. I got my coffee right here. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yeah, yeah. So awesome.
All
Awesome.
right.
Shall I maybe try share my screen
Yeah.
and then kind of go through where this started and sort of how at least I thought about some of these things.
Yeah.
So it's I was writing a forecast engine, and really the struggle came in, where do I put the different pieces to be standard compliant, I want to say. So, I go into a bit of detail. I have some external modules that I'm interacting with. I have some internal things that I've written myself, and I wasn't quite sure where to put them and how to structure them. So I do have a repo, and I'll share the link with people, so that we can just share that knowledge and have everyone be able to look at it as a reference. It is Python. I know, Hassan, you're more in the C# world, but I'm sure we can just talk structure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Go from there. So the first one here was this AMA module, which comes from an external package. I saw this needing to be a broker because effectively I'm interacting with this external world, and that's sort of where I saw that broker definition being. So I've got an interface. I've tried to follow a little more of the C# standard of naming there to try and make it a bit cleaner.
Yep.
But effectively, all I really want in this is a little bit of structure on what are the minimum variables so that there's consistency across them. And then also what are those methods that I'd want accessible to all of my different forecasting methods or models that I might have.
That's right.
We can run this guy sort of locally quite quickly, and we can see a nice little interaction with that. That lets me forecast things into the future. I can change the number of periods. I can change how this all interacts, and things are, quite clean, quite accessible, happy with the interface, and that works nicely.
Nice.
And that works for other modules as well. So if I go for sklearn as another external module that I might have, this makes a lot of sense to be brokers to me. So where the question came up is, what happens if I go write my own one? All right. So if I have a forecast module and I've got 0 external dependencies, in my mind, that should live as a service because I'm not necessarily interacting with the external world again.
Yes.
But I also want compliance to the same sort of structure as the broker so that I can effectively reference those in the same way. And that's where the first red flag in my head came, because I've effectively got the exact same iForecast module or model now in 2 different places, and that leaves potential for drift. So that's kind of the first red flag that came up with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one thing first of all, so I was just talking about Felipe, and he just popped in. He says, can you zoom in a little bit? Hey, let me tell you what we do with this. If you right click display on your desktop, just put it to 150. I know it's going to be really huge on your screen, but for someone watching on a smaller screen. Okay. So while you're doing that, let's just address this first question, right? So you have what we call a dead-end service. A dead-end service is a service that has no dependency on an external thing. And that's very common if you're building libraries, things that do machine learning and all that kind of stuff. I'll take your screen here for a second,
Sure.
Ryan, and then we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so here's the designer. Let me just pop up the screen here. Here we go. All right. Here we go. So you are in this situation where, so just for everyone to understand, the standard is not exclusive to .NET. That's what Ryan was trying to say. Like, you can use it in Python. There are actually examples out there with Java, Kotlin, Scala, even Go programming language that is standard compliant. So don't think like I do like to write in C#, but that doesn't mean that you can't apply the same principles to a different language. So just to kind of visualize what Ryan was saying, he's saying, well, I have this, what would you call it, Ryan? Like an SK stands for what? External.
Scikit-learn external library. Yeah. So 2 external libraries.
Yeah. Let's just say there's an external lib like this, and basically this external library Actually, let's put it in here because that's what we refer to non-organized, non-controlled. So there's an external library, and then you basically build a broker, right, that sits and wraps up that external library to abstract away the internals of your application, your services, right, that are sitting behind that application. So that means if you decide to change that external library, if you decide to use, like, if this is external library A and you want to use external library B, there should be absolutely no impact on your services, specifically your processing services and above. A slight impact to your foundation service, but no impact whatsoever to your processing service and above, which is totally fine. Now, his question was, well, I have a situation where whatever this external library is doing, right, is something that I want to develop myself in my own service. So this is own service, it's your own service, and there is no broker. It doesn't need to talk to a broker because whatever this library is doing, this service is already doing. What do we do then? How does this work with abstraction and all that kind of good stuff? Did I get that question right? Did I understand this proper? Okay.
So there's one additional nuance to that where I might actually change the implementation of external library A so that it doesn't actually interact the way anyone who uses external library A might expect.
Right.
So that's sort of an additional nuance to this.
Right. Right. So if you have a processing service sitting up in here, and this processing service is talking to this service, right? And your own service, this is the one that you own, will have a different implementation than what is being enforced by these external libraries, right? So now if you try to shift to this library, a lot of things will change upstream because your own service has a completely different way of implementing this than the service that relies on a broker. Did I get that right?
I've tried to minimize that through the interface so that there's at least a consistent way for me to talk to that and a consistency across that. So at least in the Python world, really the biggest change that would come through would be what settings am I passing down that line. So yes, if you were to go into the internals, but no in implementation because of that enforced interface.
Right. So there's three things here that we need to kind of think about, right? First of all, you have to enforce your own local API, whether you're using an external library or building your own implementation. And it has to be localized. What I mean by that is that it can't be influenced by the external module or component that you're using. I'll give you an example. Like, for instance, let's say that there is an external module that is enforced. It doesn't have add or update. It just have upsert. It doesn't understand anything else, right? So let's just take this as an example. Let's say there's this API that you're calling, and this API doesn't give you neither add or upsert. So this is API, external API. And this external API, you want to build a broker in here. And the broker is basically, the broker may follow the API because the broker doesn't hold business logic, so it can't remodify. The brokers are disposable. So that's why we don't unit test them, because we just throw them away, right? So let's say you have your broker in here, right? But then you have your service, and if this guy is enforcing a contract that says upsert in here, and it doesn't understand CRUD operations, it doesn't honor these CRUD operations, it's very dangerous to have your service up here be influenced by that. Your service is going to have to offer your contract, which is add and update. You might ask me the question, well, Hassan, how do I do that? The API is not giving me add or update. How am I supposed to do that? I'll tell you how. Your add is going to have to go and find out if there is an existing component in that API with the same ID. And if it does, it throws an exception. It will throw already exists component. And your update is going to have to ensure that this item exists before it performs the operation.
This
Even
sounds
though
almost like Philippe's question on the. Okay.
So you see, why are we doing it this way? Because tomorrow you're going to go use a completely different API that offers plain CRUD operations. And now you're going and saying, well, the previous API had an upsert. If you let this contract slip through your foundation service layer to your upstream services, that's a complete coupling of external and internal application, even though the models are localized. So this is a conceptual abstraction.
Okay.
Like you're not allowing an influence. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
yes.
So
okay.
Ryan, just to check with you, is this about like, in common feature of scikit-learn or common methods in scikit-learn are like fit and predict? I noticed that when
Yes.
you were abstracting, you had abstracted fit and predict, but if I like use a different library that doesn't necessarily have, like, I can't envision a machine learning library that doesn't have fit and predict, but like as a weird edge case, that doesn't have it. We've now got, it needs to have that part of its, or we need to somehow make that part of its interface, right? Like, or in our world, we will always have fit and predict. External library must always somehow, have that as part of it, right? Or
we need to handle that internally now, is
Yeah.
I think what Hassan's saying. So, we've decided we want to go fit and predict because we've made that decision. Any external service that doesn't implement that, we have to enforce that implementation because of our design decision at that foundational level.
Right.
Okay. Yep. With you. Yeah.
See, what I love about this question is two things. Now you're bringing things that I just don't have the chance to say out loud in different sessions based on the project. But going back to these three things, abstraction is not really one thing. There is conceptual abstraction. Like, even though your models are localized, you're still very heavily influenced with your external API. And I usually tell people this is the rule. If your broker is emitting or exposing APIs for non-primitive operations, start to worry. Start to think about extreme abstraction. Like, if your broker is giving you something above the basic CRUD operations, in the case of machine learning, of course, you would know like what is basic and what happens across the board versus something where the API or the external library is trying to do the work for you. Right? And these are dangerous libraries because they don't give you much control. They're basically saying, use me the way I am and let me do the magic instead of giving you the ingredients to make whatever meal you want for yourself. You see what I'm saying? Like, there are these libraries that will go and say, oh, don't worry about anything. Just put this magic API key and I'll do everything else for you. But what if I want the ingredient as a software engineer so I can mutate the operation the way I want? Right? So abstraction, there's a physical basic abstraction where you kind of localize all the models. Everybody knows how to do that. But the conceptual abstraction, that's the hard part, right? And then there's a hybrid one, like there's a model enforced by your framework. That these are the hardest one. Even it's way above my pay grade. Some of these problems, it's just very hard to solve. I need to pull smart people to come in and tell me what to do, right? But you get the basics and the ideas. So in your situation, going back to this, if your service that relies on a broker for an external library is somewhat different than your own service implementation, then you have a contract abstraction problem that needs to be solved. Like, they're not unified contract and you have to enforce this unification. So whether you decide to use a broker neighboring service or a dead end service, it doesn't matter. Like, your processing service or upstream services are none the wiser. They don't see any difference in models or concepts. It's not an easy problem to solve, just to let you know. But it's an important one to solve.
So can I ask on that level, if I need to make sure that my model is consistent all the way across, then what happens if, let's say, my external one requires certain parameters, and a good example of that is, we've got a linear regression that's quite simple. You can just do it with your X and Y data, you're good to go. And now I've got a seasonal one that needs a seasonal period as one of those parameters. Now, that seems to break that contract that you were just describing, because effectively they're a different model of data that I need. Yeah, sorry. Looks like you've
Yeah.
got an answer.
No, yeah, absolutely. By the way, you always have the right, I don't know if you can implement that in Python, but you always have the right to either do optional parameters,
Yes.
parameters that you may or may not pass, or your API contract will have a completely different method that in some implementation will throw not applicable exception. And in some other
Yes.
contracts will so applicable and actually gives you the actual implementation. You always have that right to go and say, for this V1, this particular API or contract will not support this optional parameter, but your contract stays the same. Now, let me just tell you this. There's a little bit of influence here from the libraries that you're relying on, because they're effectively saying, I can do something that someone else can't. So now your contract looks completely weird because you have this additional parameter. It's basically a materialized influence of, downstream dependencies that are making you do this, right? It's really up to you. But how I would solve this problem just off the top, optional parameters, or a completely different API that throws not implemented or not applicable perspective exception. That's the way I would go about doing something like that.
Can I clarify the understanding there? Are you saying you'd have a singular model? Let's say I have 20 different forecasting methods that I could apply.
Yep.
Each of them have slightly different things, and sometimes it's seasonal period, sometimes it's seasonal periods plural, sometimes it's just seasonality. Are you saying I'd have a singular model with each of those options in
No,
there?
no.
That's what I'm not worried about.
If they mean the same thing, you have to map them all towards one unified contract somehow. So if it's season and seasons, right, then your contract will be an array that takes one item in one implementation and multiple items in different implementations. And you get to name it whatever you want. If you have to follow the exact same naming convention of the external library, then you're being influenced by that external library. Work really, really hard to kind of rename and streamline. I'll give you an example. I've seen this in a project, right? You'll see this is external contract. This is external model 1, right? This is external model 1 in here. An external, we saw that when we were building the .NET API library for OpenAI, right? And this is 2, right? And one of them will say in here, it will say, let's just for example, it will say ID. Let's say input ID in here. That's a property, right? But in here it says input IDs. So one model takes an array and the other model takes one. What would be your final model looking like to support both? Oh, I'll tell you. You will have your local model, and your local model will support both by having something that encapsulates both scenarios, which is input IDs. It'll take one parameter in one and multiple parameters in the other.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then you have to work on your documentation. You basically say, even though we offer that, you should know,
in this model.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't necessarily say, well, it has the option of being either model 1 or model 2. And really, you would see that model as a settings type that has an entry point or something like that. So instead of saying input IDs, just saying something like settings, and those settings can be of type external model 1 or external model 2, because then it's a simplified interface internally. Either way, you still have to understand the external model implementation. But now I've made my developer experience more explicit.
Yeah. So let me tell you this. Can you do dependency injection in Python?
Yes.
You should, right? Okay. So if that's the case, normally what I would do is that you will have this unified contract, I contract, right? And this I contract has model 1 and model 2 that implements that contract. So this is model 1 and that's model 2. So both of them will implement, these are services, both of them will implement this I contract. because your foundation service is doing the mapping for you, right?
Yes.
So based on that implementation, you're really switching the dependency that implements the same contract. And when you switch the dependency, you still have the right to go and say, because both of these models implement the same thing, the concrete implementation will have that explicit naming for that model. You see what I'm saying? So
Yes.
basically, like if this is I machine learning service like this, and that's the contract, this will be Ryan's service, Ryan machine learning service, and this will be Trent's machine learning service. Because each, and this Ryan and Trent, that's basically the model name that you're implementing for that concrete implementation.
So one of the challenges we've had on clients trying to do this is now I have a subtle separate or the potential of a subtle separation between my model that I've got and the underlying model that machine learning model that I choose.
Yes.
So the config gives me the ability to choose Trent's machine learning service, but actually call Ryan's machine learning service. How do we prevent that drift without overly coupling those two? Sorry, I don't know if that
No,
makes
yeah,
sense.
no, absolutely. So you're basically, so if you use the settings model, you're gonna end up with extremely coupled code, because if you have just the one service that basically says, based like this is machine learning service, and you have this model that you're passing in, and let's call this model your settings, right? And based on the settings, it gets to choose which model it works with. What do you think is going to happen here? This is going to be extremely complicated. Imagine if you have 20,
Yeah.
how about 40, right? So now this guy keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and your settings start to become, but if you follow this particular, each and every one of them has its own code base that is not more than 20 lines of code probably, you know, and you can switch them, you know, at will this way. By the way, you still have the right to go and say in the caller of the implementation of this machine learning service, which one you want to choose. At least in the C# world, you can go and pull the services collection and say, I want that particular implementation of that contract. If you have that power to do in Python, and excuse me, I'm super ignorant in Python, but you know, if you can do that power in Python, then that solves the problem of choosing the settings. What I'm trying to say is, whatever is dependent on this machine learning service, let's call it ML processing service, right? You still have the right to go and say, based on my settings contract, I can refer to the model I want, and it will, based on this contract, it will go and say, pick up that particular implementation. So this way you broke the coupling, because you don't have this huge set of dependencies. You still have a contract, an interface, and a concrete implementation, but someone else is making the decision of which implementation of which model service you want to run.
So I think, sorry, this points to a
Standardized provider abstraction library. I'll tell you about this in a second. I'm just trying to walk you through. It's, by the way, what you're talking about is a huge discussion. Let me just show you something, just as a teaser, and then I'll tell you. Let me just show you something in here. In the standard itself, at least the last release, we talked about something called SPAL, Standardized Provider Abstraction Library, and this guy, it's right. Let's see. There it is, Standardized Provider Abstraction. The idea of this library is that you could have many providers, but there's one library that they all implement the contract of this abstraction library, and then your consumer, your brokers, is dealing with the same thing all the time. But I don't want to confuse you yet. Rahul, stop right now. You're confusing them. This
sounds right.
Yeah.
No, I was saying this sounds right. That's
Yeah.
sort of the direction I want to go. I've just
Yeah.
struggled to know how to place it, and I think some of that is I'm trying to stick to my understanding of the standard. Like, oh, it's a custom implementation, therefore it's a service.
By the way, you always have the right to go and say, even though this is my own service, you can always, you know, wrap it up in a library and sit it behind the some broker, right? Like that. You always have that right. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, to me, from my perspective, wrapping up your work in some abstract library just gives other people the ability to leverage it as well, instead of it living in a larger domain system, right? It becomes a utility system. But that's also another decision. That's outside of this, right? But the
Yeah.
scenario itself is very legitimate. Like, what if the own service is doing something really simple, right? It doesn't really live up yet to being a library, right? Like in a simpler
Yes.
scenario. In that case, you have to enforce the contract. Like, whatever
Uh-huh.
iService may be, whatever this iService in here may be, it has to be extremely generic and not influenced by, and by the way, just so you understand, Ryan, this question that you're asking is important, because it's the reason why 90% of large enterprise systems today are extremely hard to maintain, because they let that influence really go through the roots of your core business logic, and then they create this, like, some people will understand this. The folks out there that are relying on SAP, it's a very famous ERP system, and they use the APIs and they let that contract go all the way to their core business logic. They will never be able to get out of SAP unless they rewrite the entire system, right? So that's you
Yeah.
holding it at the gate. That's good engineering right there. That's you basically holding it right at the gate, and you're saying, I can't let you influence my internal business logic.
It'd be interesting if we bring up pandas to a lot of data science folks, because I feel like that, like in every data science application, that gets baked straight in. Like the first thing that happens is like, nope, use the data frame type or something like that.
Yeah.
Every application is now like try and migrate from pandas to, let's say, like Apache Spark, which gives you similar functionality. You're stuck, right? Or at least I have job security for a little while
Yep.
because of that. Yeah.
Yep. And this is why you'll find a lot of companies, Trent, that will say, we want a SharePoint specialist. Why is that? Because they
Yeah.
built all their systems around this system that they really despise. There's this book that I'm reading. Let me just tell you this. There's this book that I'm reading. It's called The Internet Con, How to Seize the Means in Computation, right?
Okay.
This guy talks about something interesting in this book called the switch cost. The switch cost is that the system becomes so inert, your business logics become so inert, so hopelessly dependent on this external dependency, that it can't escape it.
Yeah.
So business people will go to the engineers and say, well, the system is failing. How do we make it work? Oh, let's put retry logic and let's put all this craziness just to remedy the craziness of that core system, because the switch cost is extremely expensive. Ask any big enterprise out there to switch over from SAP. They'll tell you it's hundreds of millions of dollars, because we let it eat up right into the core of our business logic. It's a problem, right? So standardizing your system could save you from falling into that trap. And then SPAL, which is what Rahul was just talking about, people are watching you from Spain, just so you know, I mean everywhere, but he's basically telling you the standard community have been solving a problem of building an abstract library, and if you want to use any dependency, you have to write an implementation that adheres to the contract of that abstract library. So whatever domain business that you're building that talks to that library, it talks to the same contract. So if you want to switch between, I don't know, SendGrid for emails to Exchange Server to Graph API, no change. Like, there's no change, because it's implementing the exact same business logic. We did something similar with mock. The mock library, there was a lot of drama in the
Yeah.
news about there's spyware and stuff like that. We just forked it, we gave it a different name, and we adhered to the same contract. So thousands of engineers out there were able to switch to clean mock without writing one line of code. It's a very similar experience, except that there is a true abstraction. Like, you're actually talking to SQL versus talking to MySQL versus talking to Postgres versus just talking to the exact same code with a different name.
Yeah, man. We haven't. Well, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun, Ryan, but it's an interesting example we've been talking about actually on this exact topic. But yeah, Ryan, if you wanna.
May I steal the screen share again to walk through that
Yeah. Let
example?
me add you in. So where is? Okay, yeah. Go ahead, share your screen. I'll add you in.
Let me just get that up again and then share here.
There you go.
Great. So the sort of discussion we had around that is I wanted to try keep my underlying models as, I think the word you used there was primitive as possible. So when I'm passing in for the fitness section, my data is of type iterable float, which then means it can be a list or Trent mentioned pandas data frames or Spark. Effectively, as long as it's iterable or the underlying code implements the like native Python iterable type,
that's legit,
and has
yes.
a number, then it'll work. And that to me was the most flexible for my sort of lowest level. I think you call them foundational.
Yep, foundation services.
Yeah. So that's sort of the thinking that I had in there. Now, the challenge is when I went to the modeling part, like you're saying, I don't want to be influenced by sort of the technology or any of that. I want it to make sense to my domain. So I'm saying I'd want a date and I'd want a value because generally, when I'm dealing with forecasting, I'm looking at dates and I'm looking at the value at that date. Now, the math behind that, it's more computationally efficient for me not to look at a date and just look at an index or a number around that. So the first challenge is this date effectively falls away once I've potentially done some processing, and the types of processing that might happen is I might put in what we call zero buckets. So let's say this is sales, and on this day, that sale, no sales happened. I don't want to miss that date because then I'm not getting that physical value.
That's right.
I might put in a zero there.
Yep.
So that's the first layer of that modeling in my mind.
Yep.
And then the challenge is, well, I don't just have a singular instance of this. I now have a set or a series of these. So again, the thinking was an iterable of type forecast, so that I can then map that through.
That's legitimate. That's legit.
So this is where the challenge for us actually came in, is that we're often dealing with these data frames in the data science world, and people are more comfortable in those. So we want to make our developer experience as comfortable as possible. But we also want that flexibility of our underlying engine. So, one of the ways we try to approach that was to say, okay, well, let's make our own data frame type that then implements a data frame engine enum, so that we can say, okay, well, pick the data frame type you want, and we'll go dynamically import that. And as long as it's effectively installed in your environment, you've now got a standardized data frame type that we've implemented. So now it's not a pandas data frame, it's our personal data frame.
That's SPAL. That's standardized provider abstraction. What you just did. You're basically saying whatever the provider is, they're still dealing with the same type. However, I have to warn you, you can't have your data carrier models be also implementation models. Like you either have routines or data, but you can't have both sitting together. You can't have a printer with, like, the paper is different from the printer. The paper is the data and the printer is the routine, right? The chicken is the data and the microwave is the routine. They're not the same thing. the reason why I enforce like separation between these two, because the chicken can be cooked in an oven, on fire, on a microwave. But if you make the chicken and the oven the same thing, you can only cook it in the oven. It becomes a problem. You see, I'm not super hungry yet, but chicken is what came to mind,
Getting this.
And my apologies for the vegetarian folks out there. But what you did right there, that's absolutely the way the standard is advocating for abstraction. If your external customers or consumers of your library, they need to deal with a unified contract. And then whatever provider underneath you decide to work with, That's the beauty of software. You're basically telling them you don't have to do too much work to switch from provider A to provider B, because all you have to do is just change a configuration or choose a different library that implements the exact same contract, right? Now, this part underneath where you basically try to map things, that needs to live somewhere in a service, somewhere in some service.
Okay.
But that seems like outside of the question that you're asking. So
So,
Can,
yeah, Trent, do you want to jump in? So, yeah.
sorry, Brian, I don't want to break your train of thought. Do you want to ask your question?
No, I'm going to move on from there. So, go for it.
So yeah, the way actually, we were working on something together, and we came across this problem to just kind of validate that point. If we, let's say in my application, I just want to do, let's say, like group buys, and maybe let's say like group buys and maybe some sort of like some other method. Sorry, nothing's coming to mind at the moment. But the way I'd abstract it is I'd write my own data frame class over here. It would have a method called group by. Now I've got a broker for, like, let's say, my simple data frame class over here. And then underneath, when I actually implement it, so instead of data frame, when I have a concrete implementation of it, I can implement the group by like the way Pandas does, perhaps by the way Spark does, and then I can switch them out and say, okay, this is the way to approach it.
Yep.
Now, one other interesting thing, and maybe the concept of spells will answer this, is this feels like we're abstracting from a technology, right? From a technology itself. In this case, I'm abstracting from Pandas and Spark. Whereas what I've seen from reading through things like OSSS is generally my brokers talk about objects that exist in my system. For example, student, right? I don't care if student is. But spells are now these abstractions from technology rather than models in my system. Right?
It's a step further, and it kind of pisses off a lot of the. By the way, just so you understand, like there's a lot of providers out there, commercial providers, that want you to be coupled with their systems, right?
Yeah.
Spell kinds of our way of saying no. I should be, as a developer, have the absolute freedom to switch between Azure and AWS and Google Cloud without having to rewrite my code.
Yeah.
So in your case, between Panda and Spark and all of these different systems, I should be able to switch between these two systems with the least amount of effort possible. And if you allow it to seep through and go through your system, you're basically buying into. That's why a lot of providers, they make it a closed box, and they do work and logic for you. So you just can't abstract easily. You're looking for the primitive operation so you can switch in the future. So it is in their best interest to give you the most complex operations and models. So it's very hard for you to switch out. Think about the upsert model that I told you, right? Like if you're using blob storages in Azure, they'll tell you, oh, you don't have to think about add and an update. We'll just give you an upsert, right? If you let that go through your system all the way to your exposure layer, now you're forever married, to Azure blobs. You can never switch out of it. It becomes a problem, right? But to your point, yes, and then, there's later the conversation about hosting the service itself, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But yes.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that helps a lot actually. So around a lot of like our data frame engine name and that kind of stuff, I think we pull that out and just implement like a data frame with methods that we actually use. Maybe if you want to abstract everything, maybe be doing a lot of work for everyone else, but maybe what we just need to abstract like those methods, But
let me just tell you this, Trent. If you abstract, it's a lot of work at the beginning, but it's no work in the future. It's literally no work in the future. If you don't put time and effort into abstraction in the future, like, listen, people change all the time, right? Providers change. Like, do you remember, like, I don't know if you guys heard about this, but Unity framework.
Yeah.
They just changed their business model completely, right? So for a startup, an indie startup developing indie games that is trying to make it in the market, they can't afford that commercial kind of thing. But if they abstracted the dependency on Unity and they were able to switch with no cost, that's a win. And we as engineers, we should kind of,
want that.
as software engineers and architects, you have to always live 10 years in the future, because Murphy's law, whatever can happen will happen.
Yep. 100%.
So I think it's with that in mind that we try to do this, where really what we're doing here is saying, when I access my data frame engine, I'm getting the implementation that you've chosen. And that's really all that this class is doing. So the reason for the dynamic import is actually partially to prevent random failures, where we've seen other people do try accepts in there to try and manage that. We didn't like that implementation.
That's hacky.
So we said,
yes.
hey, make the explicit choice, and then effectively that will expose this data frame engine to you, which will then be the actual implementation dynamically loaded in. And this was the most efficient way we, at the time, could figure that out.
Yep.
So this is actually not a model yet. And I think that's where there's a subtle difference in the way, and the closest in my mind to the C# that makes sense is like entity framework. It would be like choosing entity framework, or I think it's
there's Dapper.
Link,
Dapper versus entity framework.
Dapper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is almost like saying, okay, make that choice, Dapper entity framework, and effectively it'll import that one. And now this data frame engine is what's accessible to you. Is it entity framework or is it Dapper?
That's now, exactly what SPAL is. Yes, go ahead.
So this is where our challenge came in. Now, if I want to go back to this guy, right, which is what we kind of said, yeah, this makes a lot of sense because it's as generic and like lower level as can be, I now lose the computational efficiency. And Python is a little bit not the greatest at that, which is why people often move towards things like Spark and Pandas. So, I'm almost hesitant to take that Pandas data frame and say, force it into my iterable forecast data. Because if I force it into my iterable forecast data, firstly, there's the computational time of doing that feels unnecessary because I've already loaded that in. And that doesn't sit well in my head. Yeah. And then the second part is, now I've transferred it into my internal model.
Local model,
now that's all sitting in RAM, where often the reason for me moving to something like Spark is a singular machine can't handle that in the RAM.
Yeah.
And this is where we started running into
that's a great
do we approach there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, go ahead.
So the closest I personally have been able to get to, I'm just going to find the gist that I put that in. Give me one sec. So the closest that I've been able to figure that potentially would work with this is actually pulling out the schema into a complete different validation schema. So in this example, what I have is there's a module, and this is just a gist, so it's not perfectly laid out. So there's a JSON schema, and what the JSON schema allows me to do is specify the properties that I might want in this, as well as the data types that they might have. And then effectively, whether I'm using Pandas or something else, as long as I implement the schema that I want, which feels very similar to the model you were describing.
Yep.
And then I have a get validator and I have a get invalidator, and it validates against my schema. I then still keep that computational efficiency of my underlying technology while abstracting my data model and enforcing and encouraging a good data model.
Yes.
Are we in the right direction? Like, where
So,
do we start?
so that's a beautiful question, and this is advanced programming right there. And I'll tell you what some engineers have done in the past to kind of solve that problem. Okay, if you're loading data in the RAM, you're probably going in the wrong direction, especially if that data is not hot data and on demand. You know, hot data. You guys are the data, gurus. So the hot, cold, warm data. Just so you understand. Look, how we solve that problem in the .NET world, and I'll take your screen for a minute. You don't have to unshare because I can control the
Okay.
back and forth, so I'll put it back for you. Look at this. In .NET, there's the concept of iQueryable. An iQueryable of a student basically says you can go and say, if you have an iQueryable of students, right, do not materialize and execute on the engine, not on the client side, on the engine, the server, the remote place where the data lives, unless you materialize, which means if I go here and say this is an iQueryable of student, Ryan named students. If I go and do this, students where student.name contains Ryan, none of that runs on the client, and none of that runs on the server either until you go and say materialize, meaning Ryan named students have to be mapped into an actual physical list. So how did .NET folks implement this side, right? Because you could do something very similar. This .list knows, like this iQueryable carries with it the provider. So you will see in this iQueryable, inside the implementation of iQueryable, queryable, I forgot how to queryable, right? Inside of it, there is a thing called provider. And that provider can be, SQL, it can be NoSQL, it can be, this is how the entity framework goes and talks to a SQL server versus talking to a MongoDB or a Postgres or Cosmos DB, whatever is out there. Okay? So in your model, if you're going to implement a local model, somehow that model needs to carry something that triggers a call on the remote server when asked to materialize the data.
And the materialize of data, you want to be as close to the native types of the language as possible. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So you don't have to load anything in memory. Like you're thinking about, in order for me to execute my local model, I need to get everything in the external model and map it into the local model so it's ready to be consumed according to the local model. No, not at all. You can execute upon materialize. It's like lazy loading. You're basically the iQueryable is basically what we call deferred execution. Like it doesn't execute until you really, really, really want to see the data, right? So as long as iQueryable is traveling from a broker to a service to an orchestration to a controller, all the way up there, it's not materializable, and it doesn't need to be.
And that would work really nicely, Trent, with Spark.
Yeah.
Because it does that under the hood.
Yeah, lazy evaluation. Yeah. It's kind of like a good analogy I heard is like before I like buy my groceries, I compile a list of my groceries and then go and buy my groceries, right? Instead of like one item at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is a name for it. I'm just not smart enough. I think there's like a greedy implementation or greedy algorithm where you basically go and get all the data first instead of just waiting until you understand what you exactly need, right? I don't know if you guys have Costco over there. Just excuse my ignorance, but it's like you buy at the lot at large quantities, right? And it doesn't make sense to go over there and buy everything instead of just waiting first to see what do you really need, right? That's part of the things that makes OData very powerful, is that you're shipping the query in the API call, so the query will execute on the database server, not on the client server. Now, I
So
don't know
if
how.
we were, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead,
After
Ryan.
you, after you.
I don't know how you're gonna implement that. Like I can't, like in Python, I'm super ignorant in Python, but this is the way I would go about it. Somehow your deferred execution model should have a generic reference to a provider, and that provider knows how to map your local model into their external native model. That's why Spell comes to be. By the way, I'm telling you to do a lot of work, just so you understand. I don't know if you've noticed,
Yeah.
but it's a lot of work. But is it worth it? It's absolutely 100% worth it, because you know what, Ryan? 2 years from now, XYZ framework is going to be the thing, and switching to XYZ will be very expensive if you don't think about abstraction today. And just so you understand, you will hear some people that will tell you, Yagni, you're not going to need it, right? A lot of people will say this in the industry. They say, oh, you're not going to need it, right? Until you do, and then it costs like $10 million. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can say on the client, we're just drilling off now. We implemented this sort of thinking where we said, hey, I've got my local pandas provider, and then I've got an AWS provider, and literally we wrote the AWS one and implemented it in under 5 minutes live with the client, and it was like super clean, and it sold them on it.
uh-huh.
It
Until
was,
it gets
yeah,
more complex and you decide to switch over, and it's great. Like the honeymoon stage of any technology is amazing. Oh my God, look, I can just right click and publish to Azure, and I'm a hero, right? But when it
yeah.
comes to actually properly switch over, even with Azure, like within the same provider, you might switch to a different version or a different thing within the same provider, and then it becomes very hard to do that switch. So you should trust your own instincts as a developer, and don't let anyone make you think otherwise. Do you see this application growing? Right? Going back to this law, whatever can happen will happen. Do you see the application growing? Do you see technology changing? Do you see you switching over to other technologies? If the answer is yes, 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 you have to think about abstraction.
So I mean, the abstraction is one of our goals within the data and analytics sort of section that we're trying to do. Is we need to be able to deploy to either AWS, Azure, Google Cloud with as little effort as possible and as little change to our code base as possible,
Yep.
without making it like config nightmare.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And
Absolutely. Yep.
so that's the goal. It's our ultimate goal. Yeah. If I were to jump back to this
Yeah.
iQueryable
Yeah.
idea, though, and I think about sort of the implementation that we were talking about, where my lowest level engine or forecast model has effectively the iterable, and that's the two list that you've got there.
Mhm.
Does that mean I'm passing my iQueryable effectively from my exposure point all the way through, so that I've passed that config object all the way through, and only effectively at the time I call my forecast model, I then
Yes.
do the to
Yes.
list?
Yes. That's exactly how we do it, from an API controller to a service to the broker to the entity framework, which talks to SQL. That's exactly how it works. And it doesn't materialize until you actually call for materialization. And it's totally
And
okay. As long as iQueryable is local or native model, and as long as whatever inside iQueryable is local model. These two things. I'm not going to say native because it's very unlikely, but when I mean native, I mean something that comes with the Python framework, like the
core,
language
right?
itself, right?
Yeah.
So,
So your to list, and that's effectively what keeps that consistency between different providers.
yes.
Okay.
Now,
And
granted,
yeah.
go ahead, go ahead.
No, after you,
Granted, you are in situations where here, like in the database example, yeah, it's true. You could have the luxury of having your own local model traveling, but that's not always the case in everything. Like if this is your exposure or exposure layer, this is your exposure layer. right? And you have a service sitting right here. So let's say this exposure layer is talking to service A, right? Service A, actually, it's not really talking to a service A, it's talking to iService, right? And iService, really, like for the sake of simplicity, I go and say service controller, service broker, but it's actually controller to iService, service to iBroker. It's a stair. It's not a flat line. It's actually stairs that you go through like that. But here's the deal. Under iService, right, you will find something interesting. You'll find multiple services implementation. So there's service A that implements iService, and then there's service B that implements iService. Okay. Now here's where it gets interesting, right? If the model, like let's say you are sending here as an input parameter an iQueryable of student, right? And in your case, this model is not yours to control. Like whatever broker that's sitting behind service A and whatever broker is sitting behind service B is a completely specific model to the external library that you're working with, right? Then your service will be the one turning the non-material yet query into the model that fits that broker A and broker B. And this is not an easy task, but it's not impossible either.
Do you have a name for that? Because I remember early days when I started engaging, I used the word mapper, and you didn't like the idea of a mapper. What you've described sounds like a bit of a mapper, but I'm just not sure what to call it, because I think naming helps.
Oh no, absolutely. Mapping is 100% the right name for it. I'm talking about auto mapping, like using an external library to do the mapping for you. So it just creates a whole new level of dependency inside of your, well, that's what a lot of people do. They go create a DTL model, and then they go create a domain model, and they do the mapping back and forth between that. Absolute waste of time and energy and memory and everything else in between. Because here's what people do. They bring in this little demon here, and they basically involve that into the service itself. So you have external code living in your core business logic, right?
Yes.
There's even worse. Like every time I say it couldn't get any worse than that, someone proves me wrong. Someone puts it right here at the exposure layer. so stay away from auto mapping. You still have to do mapping. I'm 100% with you, but not auto mapping with an external provider. That's a complete problem, and it doesn't make sense. But in this case, yeah, your service A and service B is mapping from local model to external model. That's totally fine. By all means, we did that in the OpenAI problem.
Okay. So can I steal screen share again? Because I think I've implemented something similar to this.
Go for it.
With what I've called the forecast method. Are you guys able to see again?
I can see it. Felipe, let me know if it's too small, if you're still there. Okay, go for it.
So this is where I sort of had that broker and service idea, and effectively I'm saying, hey, well, I want to implement either, and this is that optional that you were talking about. So I'm saying it is allowed to be effectively either the broker version or the service version of those two. And that model must be one of those two and must implement it. And then effectively I've got the data, which is that underlying array type that I want later, and the same for forecast method and backcast. I then effectively let someone pick the model name to try and make that interface a bit simpler for them as a developer. And this is where I start getting, I want to say, uncomfortable with it as an implementation. And the reason I say that is effectively this now abstracts the definition of my class, and we're kind of cheating with dictionaries here. There's a cool little way for me to effectively have default available factory things where it's going to look up against this and return the class, and then I can pass in a custom one that can come from my init function or my constructor. and then effectively it'll just say, hey, if you have the same name, whichever one was given last will override it. So it gives me a nice way to actually say to people, hey, if you want to override how my default application works, you can even do that. So I really like it from that perspective because it gives the developer the flexibility.
Yep.
Where I dislike it is I now lose effectively this type hinting that can come up from my underlying model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to what we were talking about, where I now don't like natively know as a developer know that I need the specific things. And what it sounds like from what you said is I should have a model in between these two
Yep.
that deals with my fit and deals with my predict so that I don't have this problem. So I think you answered the question earlier.
And just so you know, your exposure layer should be documented. Like it should have the documentation. I don't put commenting or documentation on internal models or internal routines, but wherever your user is not going to be able to see the code, you should put documentation.
Okay. So maybe just to sort of solidify that thought, effectively you're saying that this fit should be my internal model, and therefore I'm not going to have that problem of what I pass in
Yep.
from one system to the next. Is that
Yep.
effectively the solution?
Yes.
Okay.
At least that's what
That
I'm
makes
proposing
sense.
here.
Yeah. Okay.
Just trust that, you know, you may be also able to come up with even a better solution, but to the extent of my knowledge, this is what I would do. Because remember, the standard is theories, principles, patterns, and tools. We are talking about a pattern that implements the principle of abstraction that goes up to the tri-nature theory. So the implementation or the pattern can change all the time as long as you're fulfilling the same principle to the same theory or standard. So it's a lot of work though, just so you understand. It's a hell lot of work. Like you wouldn't believe the amount of work, and nobody would understand this. By the way, just to let you know, quite a bit, even not just non-technical people, not the muggles who don't speak our language, but also the, you know, for people who don't understand, this is a Harry Potter reference, but you know, the people who don't understand our language, but also even in the engineering community, you will find people coming out and be like, why are you doing that? Right? And my answer usually is so I don't have to pay $10 million down the line to, you know, detach. You know, it'll be like it'll be, you know, the Play-Doh. Do you guys know Play-Doh? You know, you mix things together. Imagine when you mix colors together. Good luck trying to get the blue out of the yellow. Abstraction helps you do that. So,
yeah.
So,
I'm just imagining her son trying.
It's just a bit like crazy. I should talk to AI and just kind of, you know, generate a model of a guy trying to abstract and separate. Just so you know, if you're trying to build this, so this is the social aspect of software engineering, right? If you build this SPAL library, like standardized provider abstraction library, it's an abstraction library. Like it's not meant to be used, but it's rather meant to be inherited and implemented into something that wants to adhere to the same contract. All right. If you do it this way, then your impact will extend beyond your entire career because people will continue to look at this abstraction library as the de facto of implementing providers that are pluggable, plug and play into any system.
I mean, that's where we want to be, right, Trent?
I really highly advise you to do so. It'll help you a lot. You know, I'll tell you this, a lot of the open source software and the work that I did some 10 years ago still benefits me today because I can always go back and say, oh, I already solved that problem. So you solve enough problems and the community helps you solve enough problems, your speed. Let me explain this to you. This is a very important piece. If like the work that you're doing today, if it doesn't help you 10 years from now be faster, stronger, and, you know, build smarter applications, just physics, the older we get, the slower we get. So if you don't have these problems pre-solved, you can easily be, exceeded by any other new engineer, because they're coming in with these new technologies and stuff like that. You're supposed to be faster, right? They're supposed to gain momentum as you're progressing, in your craft as a software engineer. If you're implementing things the exact same way 10 years ago, then you're not growing. You're having even if you're getting a lot of recognition and promotion and whatnot, every engineer know themselves whether they're growing or not, truly growing or not. So just keep that in mind.
Definitely.
Okay. I basically told you go do a boatload of work. I hate to do this to people, but that's basically the gist of it. Mm. And please read the
So
chapter about SPAL. Also read about
yes.
SFAL. SFAL is even harder, but that's standardized framework abstraction. Like Python doesn't have to live on standard Python libraries, but it lives on an implementation of an abstraction that may or may not implement the existing standard Python library. That's just the community just going completely, truly free from any, but that's, yeah. So,
Next level.
yeah, that's a whole new thing.
That's exciting.
Mhm.
So sorry, if we jump back to that idea of the model, then does abstracting that model into something like JSON, which then in my mind effectively makes it language agnostic, getting to that sort of thinking that you were just describing, is that the right sort of direction in that?
What you just said even bypasses my idea of abstraction. Like, I just learned something from you today. I never thought about building models in that fashion. And that's freaking wild. Like, you just basically just gave me the idea of C#, Java, Python could use the exact same module somehow, because it doesn't implement, it's not language dependent, which is basically the idea of RESTful APIs. But oh my God, man, I love you so much. You just gave me something huge. Let me just tell you why. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you what you just did. You just did a big problem. Let me just tell you what you did. So APIs, RESTful APIs, introduced this amazing, crazy idea of language and technology agnostic kind of approach to solving problems. But never have I thought in a million years of implementing the same model at the local level. At the local level, you're basically saying, I don't want to pay for an API or stand up an API in the cloud or run an API locally. Can I just build a library that is agnostic enough that any other programming language could run it? Oh my God, Ryan, this is wild, because you're basically saying there's the other inherited cost, brother, into abstraction, which is, what if we have no more COBOL developers?
Yeah.
And everyone now is writing in Python. You see that how we fell into the trap of non-abstraction, but on a completely new level, which is a programming language. But if you agree on an XML or JSON,
then it doesn't matter.
you're something else. You are something else. If you're someone out there is watching this, you could change everything.
So
We need to have a standard community goal about this. But anyway, go ahead.
So this is sort of where we're thinking. So a lot of our consultants are slightly less technical. They focus more on process, and you could think about it like a more typical BA process. Mm-hmm. And they're more comfortable in Excel. So our sort of one of the things we're thinking about here is, can I abstract my model from Excel into JSON, that JSON be validated as a valid JSON schema? Because this is one of the problems we had, right? Where we build an internal definition of what the model should be. And, now you've got things like, do I call it properties? Do I call it attributes? What is the naming convention I give it? And then how do I allow others to implement that? Because if they can't implement it, then I've lost the power of my abstraction through the JSON file. So, we ran into that problem when we tried this, because now it just sort of like, if you didn't know how the JSON object was constructed, it made no difference. You kind of screwed yourself. So we try to say, okay, well, if we have an Excel file and the Excel file had property type description, whether it's required or not, a minimum and maximum, and this is really just, and I now see where I went wrong with some of that, is I'm focusing on JSON schema as the package. I shouldn't let that happen. Thank you. I will fix this.
Yeah.
But the principle was move from Excel to JSON. Now I've got my BAs driving the schema definition. That schema definition, we're still playing with a couple of things, and effectively that same schema definition is what was being validated in my data level. So once I've gotten that schema from Excel, I can use that same schema to validate my JSON. And then there are a couple of other elements we had around that, where we were thinking about, do we actually want to, because Python is an interpreted language, there's no advantage or disadvantage to the compilation time there. But I thought about, how could I make Python closer to a compiled language by effectively taking that JSON schema and creating my data classes from that JSON object, so that I'm not now implementing someone else's definition somewhere else. So
100%.
this actually translated it in. So we're kind of thinking in that sort of direction with some of it. And then even, and this, I think you might enjoy this one, we're even then saying, hey, can I determine the version bump, as in major, minor, based on whether it's required and that sort of thing, and automatically bump my Git once I've done that.
I will advise you against that for a bit, because if the version are you increasing the version for the library that you're building, or the dependency that you're, okay, that's okay. But for the dependencies, please don't do an automatic version bump, because you might pull in code that may or may not break your system. So just so you understand, like version 12 is great. Version 13 might be completely a breaking change. But for your library, I think that's genius. I think it's great.
So this is the sort of thinking we have, but again, we're worried about kind of going, okay, well, you've given me a concept, I'm running away with it. I wanted to talk to the source.
just so you understand, just so you know, the standard is just a whole bunch of engineers. I'm just speaking their minds, right? Like, I'm just documenting this. Like, just right now, just completely introduced a thing that will always become a part of the standard, which is, let me pull back a little bit. What restricts every engineer and every business out there? The provider, that's the SPAL, and the framework, that's like .NET, whatever. And now you just talked about the language itself, right? So if you can build something that's free of the dependency on these three, you build something truly for everyone out there. So coming back to this, I'm just gonna run after this meeting and go build an example of that. Like, literally, you just got me excited enough. I guess everything happens for a reason, right? So anyway, I think you're going in that direction and abstracting the model. Stay away from Excel. My advice for you, stay away from anything that is restricted by a particular provider, right? And try to stay abstract as much as you can, right? If your implementation of software enforces people to subscribe to a particular provider, or work with a particular framework, or work with a particular language or technology, you're not doing them any favor, right? Because there is a smart dude out there that might be really smart with a different framework, and they can help you a lot, and the only thing preventing them from helping you is that you enforced that particular concrete implementation.
So I saw this, and this was actually one of the arguments Trent and I had around this: is it a broker or is it a service? And in my mind, this is a broker because I want to go fetch from Excel and put it into JSON, and that's the
No,
only
no,
sort
that's a
of
service. You're doing mapping. That's business logic.
okay.
Trent is right.
He
Any,
always
any,
is.
anywhere. Okay. Hear me out. Anywhere where you're doing selection or iteration or sequencing, that's logic, right?
Okay.
That's logic, right? That's really what this is all about. What does Felipe say? JSON and JSON schema between systems, library, and languages. Yes, Felipe, let's go build it. Thanks to Ryan. We have to, I'm gonna call it Ryan. Just the library is just gonna be called Ryan, you know? Or Rayson. So it's Ryan, JSON, Rayson. Dude, you didn't know what you just did. I know you're just talking. By the way, that's the beauty about these streams. Do you know how many engineers out there? Do you know how many engineers out there that are sitting in a pairing session or a technical session and it's a closed session and they're saying things that could change the world? Like it could literally make as bigger of impact as electricity, but it's just in that room. So nobody hears them, nobody appreciates the ideas. There's no recognition, so it just dies. You know what I mean? I promise you, you are in no way, shape, or capacity less in any way, shape, or capacity than Donald Knuth, the father of computer algorithms, Alan McKay, this Elon Musk guy. It's just the difference is that people are speaking out loud in the public, right? And then I know that Elon is from South Africa, so you know it's even a more reason that you're not in any way, shape, or I just need to voice your ideas. But to what Felipe says, Felipe, this could change the world. RESTful libraries, RESTful libraries. So anyway, just going back to my thing here, I think if you're doing mapping, that's business logic, because you have to map a model to another model, which means you need to test that, which means that you need something that does that for you. Now, granted, I'm assuming, Ryan, are you using a library to do the mapping from Excel to JSON?
Yeah, just an existing library.
So that perfect. That library will need to live behind a broker.
Yeah.
And then whatever the conversion call that's happening needs to live behind and need to live in a service.
Yeah.
It is logic to me.
So that would be these guys. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So the rows within that.
So wait. So is this all of these if statements are, see, you have selection. If you see if statement, you know that this lives in a service. The easiest thing to because that's selection. It's a decision. I'll be with Trent on this one, right? But yeah, I didn't in no way, shape, or form. It's an ongoing discussion. But yes, this is logic because you need to be able to test it, right?
Yes.
What unit testing framework does Python support today? What's it called?
So there's two. There's a built-in one that ships with it called just unit test. I think is what it's called.
Yeah, unit test.
And then there's a sort of slightly more community established one called PyTest. Yeah, and it supports all sorts of mocking and features and all of that you need. So yeah, I mean both do, but it's just one of the more widely used ones.
And don't forget nose tests for all those, or nose test for all the guys from like 2008 or something like that. But I don't think anybody uses that anymore. But yeah, predominantly those two. Yeah. The next question was it Ryan, where are your tests?
These just are Ryan just hacking stuff together while he can't sleep.
if you're doing a POC or writing infrastructure code, I don't care if you're writing unit tests for it, but if you're shipping something to production someone else needs to maintain, remember, software engineers are the very first customers of their own software. So you are your own customer. so just be careful, because whatever you're writing today, 20 years from now, I mean, not even 20 years from now, you know, a month from now, you're going to look back at the code and be like, what was this code doing? I don't know. So
there's a cool new approach that some of the Python devs are doing, and they're actually putting the unit tests in the doc strings. So your doc string describes it, but it actually also executes a unit test. So I'm thinking of testing that one out one day.
Sounds good.
Okay. So how can I get involved in the JSON thing? You're going to go hack out after this?
Yeah, come build that RACON. Build that RACON system with me. I'm telling you, man, I'm just thinking about this right now. I'll take your screen for a second. Like, I'm just thinking, oh man, you just got me excited. And I think a lot of people will be very grateful for that, because that's code that lives beyond the date. You're basically violating the concept of time here, because you're basically saying whether C# is still around 20 years, 30 years from now or not, it doesn't matter. Because if I can write a JSON like this, and the JSON says like it will go and say method like this, and let's say this method's called add, right? I'm just thinking in my head, and then inside that method, like let's say this method is an object like that, and then the method name is add, right? And inside the method there's something called params or parameters, and this guy is an array. It's very easy to implement. Like it's genius. Like if you do like this, and then you go and say, okay, here's my first parameter, and the parameter is an object like this, and you basically, I don't know why no one thought about this before, but I think it's amazing that you just brought that up, because I can go here and say name, and then I just say number 1, and then I go here and say type, and you need to agree on a universal type, which JSON already gives you that outside of the box, so you don't have to worry about that part, right? And you could also have referential types as long as the type is defined within the same JSON object. But you can basically go here and say my type here is an int like this, right? And then you have another, oh man, I can even have AI basically turn that for you into a software program. And this is number 2 like this, and then okay, these are my parameters, and then you can go here and say return, right? And you can go and say maybe an entirely new object or whatever, and you can just say here's my return, and inside that return the type is integer like this, right? And then you continue to describe your method as JSON. So now people can build libraries that take that JSON object and generate a C# library, a Python library, a .NET, a Scala library, and whatever the case may be. See how crazy this is? See what you just did? You just abstracted the language itself.
Can I show you my first attempt at doing what you've just described?
Do it. Felipe, are you watching this?
Yeah, so this was the first attempt, and I see from our discussion like some of the problems that I did where I like tied it quite closely to the framework, but I let myself actually describe where the plugins or underlying frameworks allow things to live. So I could say, hey, I want to use the framework dash in Python, and it has a processor. And then I could say, hey, where do I want to where's my entry point into this application?
Nice.
So I have a starting entry point. And then the idea was I had pipelines, and you could then drive a pipeline where you would tell it where you want that pipeline to live. So like, hey, I may want to read and clean my CSV. What was its world? So I kind of had this idea of worlds and galaxies. So like within this world, you would have different entities, and those entities would have an ID or an identifier of sorts, and then components that live within that. And then those components would have properties like you're saying there, hey, what's my file or buffer path for my thing? So I've completely abstracted that from that concept. And then a galaxy would be made up of multiple worlds. And some of those worlds could be kind of these pipelines of different processes. So you could build a sub-pipeline of what you wanted, and then access that pipeline in the process. And like in this case, I actually even went in to say, okay, go render my environment as you wanted. And this is where I see I did it wrong. And what I did as the next approach to that was try and grab a mapper sure, I haven't looked at this library in a while, so please forgive me. Effectively, I had a render engine, and that render engine would effectively say, okay, well, I don't really care what you are, go fetch the mappings related to it. And depending on what you wanted, it would go load the specific libraries that it needed to, and then drive those mappings out. So like, hey, dash, which is the one we were looking at, if I say title, it must be called H1. But in Streamlit, I think it's just called title or something along those lines. I didn't finish this process. But that was the sort of challenge around some of those. So yeah, thinking in that sort of space.
Amazing. I don't know what to say, but this, I think it's amazing. I personally think that if you do it this way, it'll be very interesting though, because if you're building a library, like just thinking this through, okay, we're putting that model out there. That means all the way down to the dead end. Like every library, every domain system relies on utility system, and utility systems may or may not rely on other utility systems or domain systems. So it has to be serializable all the way down to the last dependency, right? Like there are some languages that offer some capabilities that other languages don't, right? How do you kind of unify that? And to what Rahul just said, he said basically this is very similar to XML SOAP, right? And yes, the answer is yes, but this is more like JSON driven. It's like a new way of thinking about abstraction, and I agree. It's very interesting. I mean, that's what JSON is doing today anyway, replacing just using XML for that. Felipe also said, looks like abstract syntax tree using JSON. I think Azure Function do the same thing to bind Python methods to the MS infrastructure. Now the real question is here, Ryan, like let's just see how we can do this. Like if I go and say, let's see here, if I do this and I say from this model that I just created, convert this JSON into JSON into C# code. AI scares me, man. AI scares me a lot. It didn't understand it. It didn't know how to convert it. So that's a good thing. It basically just tried to, it saw it only as a model instead of actually doing whatever this is supposed to do. So I think it's a great idea. I personally think that if we do it this way, you can, like, let me just tell you why that's amazing and impactful. Because it means that you're respecting everyone's preference of technology, right? Without them having to make a remote and external call. That's what makes this unique from SOAP, is that you don't have to live in a remote service. You're running local on your machine. We have this concept of cloud native, cloud foreign. Cloud native is that the service, you have to pay for the cloud provider so they can use your service. But cloud foreign is saying, no, not everybody in the world can afford $500 to pay to some cloud provider when they just can't run it local, right? So if I can localize every service and upon my choice of distribution, I get to choose the cloud or not, that's basically similar to what you're doing right now. You're saying, why do I have to force, like, for instance, let me just ask you this. Up until very recently, you couldn't use .NET in Mac or Linux or whatever the case may be, right? And you need to install all of these things. But you don't want to install all of these things, right? Even if you can run the language on your local machine, you don't want to install these things. You're a Python guy or a Scala guy, right? So what if I just give you the JSON that gives you the exact same capability as .NET, but you're running it in Scala? I asked the designer of C# program, like his name is Matt Storgerson. I said to him, hey, how do we make language integration? He said that it's a very hard problem to solve. I think you just solved it. Yes, I do. I really genuinely do. It's going to be a lot of work and standardization just to kind of write. We need to write like a global standard that says this is how you define a method. This is how you define an interface. This is how you define that. And every person that's excited about the language they work with, they're going to have to go and implement that serializer,
That's standard.
right? From JSON to Scala, from JSON to .NET, from JSON to whatever. Genius. Beyond genius. I know it sounds like a thing that we're just saying, but I can see, like, almost 25 years now in the tech industry, I can see right now how this can be extremely helpful in large enterprise systems and open source software. It just takes open source to a whole new level.
So the one advantage and sort of why I started going down this route of JSON specifically was making sure that it was safe for a user to define a model and then for me to create that model in my environment without sort of exposing my underlying or doing an eval or something unsafe under the hood. You know, I wanted that safe type to come through, but within a decent structure. And one of the challenges that we've run into, and Trent and I have had many argument over this sort of structure, is how do I communicate the JSON structure? Because it's free. You know, I can put whatever I want in there. And one of the powerful things of it is I can put whatever I want in there. So I don't want to take that away from people. And, you know, I think about like an HTML page having classes. I, you know, shouldn't just have that as an array, but it should be an array of objects because there might be multiple interactions from that. What about an active state? What about an inactive state? How do I handle these things? So yeah, the biggest challenge we ran into with this so far has been, how do I communicate my JSON structure and then validate my JSON structure?
Yep. The validation is a tough one, and be careful, because this is one of the things we criticize about JavaScript, is that there's no types, right? So when you're validating, you really don't know unless you stick to some primitive types and primitive operations that you can work with. And it's quite crazy though, because people have been using JSON for abstract contracts and stateless communication forever. Why not do the same thing with routines? I guess that's what GraphQL is trying to do, but I think this is way beyond that. This is just next level. Okay.
You made my like week month.
we should define that RISON system, right? And we should let people kind of chime in. I think this will help a lot. Like, imagine, Ryan, if you're writing in Python and I'm writing in C#, and I could just share my code with you and you fully take advantage of it in your own language. I mean, AI doesn't know anything about it and doesn't know how to process it, so it's definitely something new.
It's exciting. I don't really know. It's just, how do we make it happen? Let's make it happen.
So what we do is that we set like regular cadence. We could meet, once a week or, twice a week, however you want to do it. And we basically just sit down and invite the community, and we basically discuss this. We basically talk about, but it's all about consistency and stubbornness, right? If you want something to make it out there, right, you have to keep building systems and doing it the same way until it kind of makes it up, enough for people to kind of be able to take advantage of it. I think making that standard will be very easy, just so you understand, because if there's only a handful of things that you can do at an abstract layer for a programming language. So if we can find that way to define that, I think we should be golden. We can definitely do that. I mean, if there is a CSS standard for all browsers out there, why not a JSON standard for all routines out there? Same thing.
Standard abstraction library or standard framework abstraction library. Nice.
Oh yeah, this here. So there's SPAL, that's standard provider, and there's SPAL, standard framework. You just made a standard language abstraction library. SLAL, sure. Raul says this is the beginning of SPAL. Yes. It's software for the people. Like, there's no business sitting behind this trying to profiteer off of the coupling systems. It's really just letting people use whatever they want, which was the whole idea about software in the beginning. Ada Lovelace and these people, they didn't try to profiteer off of the work that they're doing. That's pretty much what we're doing here. Okay, any other things you guys want to discuss? Anything else?
No, happy from
Okay.
my side. I think Ryan covered it. Yeah.
You've
Talk
given
to
us
me
a lot of work.
talk to me the same time next week. I will do an introduction to Rison. This is how I basically introduce something to the world. I just make a POC, and then people meet on regular cadence, and you have no idea. This could change everything. You're basically saying whatever we're doing with APIs, we should run it on a local model. Love it. Amazing and crazy at the same time. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure meeting all of you, and thanks for the people that participated with us in that stream. Please, at any time, I am at your service. Just reach out and say, hey, let's hang out again and have some AMA, and I'll be more than happy. Usually more often than ever, when people meet and hang out and they talk freely without any restriction, they come up with some amazing, crazy ideas. This is how we have electricity and airplanes and everything else, just people kind of sitting there and saying, what can we do better? And they weren't driven by a deadline or a value proposition or anything crazy like that. It was mostly just, hey, just let's do something fun. If everything in our world today was driven only by value prop, we would be still riding horses and using fire to kind of light up the way. So let's just keep thinking freely, and build great things this way.
Thank you so much for the time. This has been, exactly what we needed. I'm super excited. I don't know if I'm going to sleep tonight.
It is. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm just going to go make an introduction video and do a POC of what you just said, and just see what people do about it. I might get insulted and ridiculed, or I might be great praised, and people love what you do. And if that's the case, let's just go build it, man. I mean, what's the harm, right? And just to answer Abdul Samad, how often is the AMA session? They're on demand, they're ad hoc. So if you want to meet up and ask me, it's not a regular cadence. It's just whenever people need to ask me questions about the standard. All right. So without any further ado, I'm very grateful to meet you all and very happy to see all of you. Of course, it's very, very useful for everybody, and for the people watching and our followers, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concern, don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to donate for the Parkinson's disease. Appreciate you all. Take care.